Week 4 of the fantasy football season. Here's wide receiver start sits every matchup. This week, Thursday night, Dallas Cowboys at the New York Giants. The top receivers going at it in this one from both teams. CeeDee Lamb is start for me. I know CeeDee Lamb, his numbers haven't been that elite so far in the early going, but he didn't have a training camp as CeeDee Lamb. He still has to get his legs under him. And this week in a matchup at the New York Giants, where their secondary hasn't been good at all this season, I think Lamb has one of his better performances of the year, and he's a must-start anyway. He was the second, third overall pick in most fantasy drafts. Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, both sits for me. Cooks had a nice week 1, and the last couple weeks he didn't really get anything going as Brandon Cook, and last week dropped the football in the end zone. So he's a sit. Jalen Tolbert a sit. He's definitely getting more volume and more snaps over the last few weeks as Jalen Tolbert, but we have to see consistency. And last week in garbage time, he scored that touchdown late. So if we see more consistency and more big plays and numbers, then Tolbert could be a considered flex option. This week he's a sit. Malik Neighbors, the only receiver week in and week out for this Giant team that's a start. I think he's matchup proof. Him and Marvin Harrison, two amazing prospects to come out of college this season at the wide receiver position. And even with a quarterback like Daniel Jones, Neighbors is going out there and putting up some ball games. So he's a must-start. Wandale Robinson, he's been decent the last couple of weeks, but a little bit of a tougher matchup versus the Cowboys. He's a sit. And Darius Slayton, he's pretty much been a non-factor. This is for me as well. Next game, Cincinnati Bengals at the Carolina Panthers. Jamar Chase got back on track with a monster performance. Over 100 yards, 2 touchdowns in that tough Week 3 loss versus the Washington Commanders. And this week, a great matchup at the Carolina Panthers, where their secondary really can't stop anyone. So I expect Jamar Chase to go out there once again, put in a big game. T. Higgins a start. For me, I know he didn't do much in that Week 3 loss versus the Commanders, but he had a touchdown where he couldn't get the second foot in, and also another nice grab on the sidelines, but he was out of bounds. So him and Burrow just missing on a couple throws, and he ended that game 3 catches, 39 yards in his season debut. So T. Higgins getting his legs under him this week. I think a better week it's going to be for him in a good matchup with the Carolina Panthers. And like I said, if they hit on one of those passes, T. Higgins would have had a double-digit fantasy game and decent numbers. Andre Isovis, he's definitely become the number 3 wide receiver for the Cincinnati Bengal team. And now the last 2 games, he's had 3 touchdowns, including 5 catches, 52 yards last week versus the Washington Commanders. I believe Isovis, he still is not seeing enough snap count, and he's got to get more consistent targets because, like I said, T. Higgins is working his way back. I believe this week T. Higgins is going to be healthier. He's going to run more routes and get more targets. And Isovis could be the odd man out, obviously, in this offense. But definitely someone that should be rostered in 12-team leagues or deeper. But right now, not enough consistency to put him in the lineup. Deontay Johnson, I would give him the starting nod. After coming off an 8-catch, 122-yard touchdown game, it's hard not to put him in the starting lineup. And we just saw the Cincinnati Bengals secondary get torched by Terry McLaurin in that Week 3 loss. So Deontay Johnson, I would give the start. Adam Thielen, Xavier Legette, both are going to sit. I know Thielen found the end zone in the Week 3 victory at the Vegas Raiders, but I know Andy Dalton looked good. But I don't expect Andy Dalton to go out there once again and throw for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. I believe he could have a decent ball game versus one of his former teams is Andy Dalton, no doubt about it, but I don't think everyone's going to have a great game once against a Thielen. I would sit in Xavier Legette. He didn't really do much in that victory at the Vegas Raiders, but he's definitely someone as the season goes on that's going to develop, that's going to get more snaps, and he's going to put up, I think, decent fantasy points and be an option in 12-team leagues or deeper. This week, he's a sit. New Orleans Saints at the Atlanta Falcons. Chris Olave, he's a start each and every week. Last week, finally found the end zone. Had his best game of the season versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And this week, in a potential shootout at the Falcons, you fire up Olave each and every week as a start. Rashid Shaheed, a flex option. Last week, had the goose egg. They did take a couple deep shots to him, but it just couldn't connect with him and Derek Carr. I believe in this game, he can make some big plays versus secondary, but Shaheed's pretty much been a deep all or nothing in the early going. Drake London has started. Him and Kirk Cousins are starting to get things going for this Atlanta Falcon team. London now 2 games in a row finding the end zone. He's a big-time wide receiver. He was a second, third-round pick in most fantasy drafts. And this week in a matchup, I know the Saints defense has played well this season. I think London still goes out there, and he's a solid starting option. Darnell Mooney starting to get things going, especially the last 2 weeks, 15 targets in this time. Him and Kirk Cousins on the same page. They're going out there. They're making plays. And I think Mooney is a flex or a third receiver in 3 receiver leagues, could carve out a decent role because he's a big play wide receiver. We saw in week 2 a 41-yard touchdown, and we saw last week he had a lot of volume and a lot of drawn up screens and plays. Jacksonville Jaguars at the Houston Texans. Brian Thomas Jr., I would put him in the starting lineup. First 3 weeks of his NFL career, he's been pretty decent, Brian Thomas, as a flex option or a back-end option, and I believe he's the number 1 option on this offense. Christian Kirk is sit for me. I know Christian Kirk finally had a good ball game with 10 targets in that one for the Jacksonville Jaguars, but most of it was garbage time where they had no choice but to throw in the second half of the game. So Christian Kirk in close games this season, we really haven't seen much out of him. I know him and Trevor Lawrence have a good rapport, but I got to see just a little bit more from Christian Kirk to put him in the starting lineup. Weekly, Gabe Davis got shooken up at the end of that ball game. We don't know if he's going to play, and pretty much Gabe Davis hasn't shown much in the first 3 weeks as a Jacksonville Jaguar. This week, I know it's a decent matchup. Even if he does play, he's a sit. Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs are must starts pretty much weekly for this Houston Texan team, especially Nico Collins, one of the best receivers in all fantasy football. And Stephon Diggs, the first 2 out of 3 games, he's gone out there and had performances. And last week versus one of his former teams, 10 catches at the Minnesota Vikings. Tank Dell, a flex option in this ball game. Tank Dell is a great talent. Him and Stroud last season had some big ball games, but Tank Dell's banged up with some soreness in the wrist, his arm, and even his knees a little bit. Reports are coming out after that week 3 blowout loss at Minnesota. So Tank Dell, after coming off a double-digit fantasy day, I would have him as a flex option this week. Denver Broncos at the New York Jets. Cortland Sutton, Josh Reynolds, Little Jordan Humphrey, Marvin Mims, all sits for me. Last week definitely was an encouraging sign. Cortland Sutton looked good, had his best game of the season in that one at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But I think this ball game, it's going to be tough for Bo Nix to have the same type of success, even though it was surprising he had great success at the Bucs in that ball game. I believe this week a New York Jet defense that just shut down the New England Patriots, and both offenses are similar in ways. I think it's going to be tough for all these wide receivers to be consistent and be starting options. Now to the Jets, Garrett Wilson, he's a start. Definitely off to a slow start in the early going is Garrett Wilson. And this week it's a tough matchup, no doubt about it, with Patrick Surtain, one of the best corners in the league, most likely shadowing Wilson this whole ball game. But you still drafted Wilson early. He's not been totally horrible. He just hasn't broken out, and he's been scoring anywhere from 10 to 14 PPR points per week. This week he's a start. Allen Lazard, 3 touchdowns in 3 games so far this season. And obviously him and Aaron Rodgers have the good rapport. The only thing with Lazard, he's going to start losing snaps, I believe, is Mike Williams is getting healthier and getting back to form, where last week Williams played his most snaps and he looked decent at times, even though it didn't show up in the stat sheet. So Lazard at best is a flex. Mike Williams, that I just mentioned, he's a sit, even though he's starting to show flashes. You want to see more snaps played once again this week for Mike Williams, and you want to see a little bit more production before I feel safe to say put him in the lineup. But definitely someone that should be rostered in all 12-team leagues or deeper. Minnesota Vikings at the Green Bay Packers. Justin Jefferson, stud receiver. He was a top 5, top 6 pick overall off the board. Him and Sam Darnold, great rapport in the early going. Jalen Naylor, I got to say he's a flex option. First 3 weeks, a touchdown each game for this Minnesota Viking team. And him and Sam Darnold really have good chemistry. They were working on the second team, obviously in preseason and training camp before McCarthy went down with injury and Darnold was moved to number 1 quarterback, Jordan Addison. We have to see his role when he returns to the lineup. I know he had a great rookie season. I know he would fit with Sam Darnold in this offense on the deep ball and those long throws in the seam. But this week, like I said, we got to see his role, how many snaps he plays, if he even returns. And it's to see if he's healthy as well. So I would take 1 week to see if he plays and he's a sit. Jaden Reed back to a start each and every week for the Green Bay Packers. Jordan Love most likely back. Even though Malik Willis, he filled in well, I thought. And they won both those ball games with the Green Bay Packers, with Willis behind center. So Jaden Reed, we know he's a yard after catch machine. We know they could use him in different formations and different route trees. And this week he's a start. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Tavian Wicks, we'll see their role and how they produce in this ball game before I put them in the starting lineup. Christian Watson, we know he's a deep ball threat. We know he's a playmaker. We saw last week he had a couple big plays, but really didn't garner much fantasy points. And Romeo Doubs, he's been an up-and-down receiver for seasons now. We have 1 good week, 1 bad week type of deal. But he's the number 3 wide receiver on this roster. In my opinion, he's a sit-in. Tavian Wicks, week 2 he had a touchdown versus the Indianapolis Colts. But last week he didn't do anything is Wicks, and he's the number 4 wide receiver. He's a sit. Pittsburgh Steelers at the Indianapolis Colts. George Pickens, I know the numbers haven't been all that great, and this offense is built on running the football and playing good defense to win their ball games and short routes for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. But Pickens, I think he's a talented wide receiver. Fields, he's definitely playing within the offense, and that's another reason why they're 3-0. Pittsburgh. So George Pickens, I would still give him the nod. Calvin Austin, a sit, but someone who definitely gained my attention last week. 4 catches, 95 yards, and he found the end zone. So last season I thought Austin would show some flashes. He really didn't, and he was banged up. And coming into this year, he was banged up as well. But him and Fields hit on a couple balls, including a 55-yard slant that he took to the house was Austin. So he definitely has breakaway speed, but this week we have to see a little bit more out of him to put him in the lineup. He's a sit. And all these Colt receivers, they're just not consistent. This offense is pretty much running the football with Jonathan Taylor. Anthony Richardson spreading the football out and he running the football. And none of these receivers have really produced besides Alec Pierce this season. Michael Pittman, he just doesn't fit the offense, it seems like, what they're doing with Anthony Richardson. He hasn't done much the first 3 weeks of the season. At this time, if you're 1-2, 0-3, it's tough to throw Pittman in your lineup, so he's a sit. Alec Pierce, he's been pretty much a deep ball or nothing for the most part. And we saw that in week 3, 1 catch, 44 yards. So if you're counting on a deep ball weekly, it's not going to get fantasy owners anywhere. He's a sit. Donnie Mitchell, they drafted him early in the NFL draft this season. Haven't seen much. Him and Richardson have just missed on a couple deep connections this year. But like I said, Richardson, pretty much it's going to be a run-first offense with Taylor and Richardson spreading it out and running the football himself. And Josh Downs, he returned to the lineup. We'll see if he could get anything going. But he's a sit for me as well. Los Angeles Rams at the Chicago Bears. All these wideouts are sits. He's spreading the football out. Right now is Matthew Stafford, and that's fine. But we know Kyren Williams, he's going to get an uptick in catches out of the backfield and also running the football. This ball game, I believe, will be close between these two teams. And even last week when they were trailing the Rams, came back and won from 10 points in the second half versus the Niners. These receivers really didn't do much. They were all sits. DeMarcus Robinson, Johnson, Jordan Whittington, and Tutu until we see more consistency and good play. And also this Bears secondary is one of the better units in the league. Chicago Bears, DJ Moore, a start for me. I know the games haven't been great for DJ Moore this season, but he's still putting up back in number 2 wide receiver numbers. And this week it's a great matchup versus the Rams, where they just got torched by Jawan Jennings for 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And Moore, he's pretty much start each and every week. Rome Odunze coming off a big performance where he went over 100 yards and found the end zone in that ball game at the Indianapolis Colts. So he's definitely a flex option. I think this week it's a great matchup once again, but there's a lot of talented wide receivers. And the first 2 weeks of Dunze didn't do much, so we'll see if he could do it once again this week. But definitely a flex consideration out of Keenan Allen. He's a sit for me. We don't know if Keenan Allen's going to play in this game. And after the performance that Dunze had last week in Cole Kmet, Keenan Allen, he definitely could be down in the pecking order. And remember, he's only on a 1-year deal where Chicago, they could choose not to play him much, and his contract expires anyway after the season. And also, like I said, he's not 100%, and he missed the last 2 weeks. Philadelphia Eagles at the Tampa Bay Bucks. Devonta Smith, if he does play in this game, he's a must-start, but he took a monster hit, concussion, and I don't know if he's going to play, but if he does, we'll put him in the starting lineup. Obviously, he's the number 1 wide out. A.J. Brown most likely going to be out through the bye week, so I didn't even list them on here. Jahan Dotson, Paris Campbell, Britton Covey. I don't think they'll have enough volume, even though those could be the top 3 wide receivers this week for this Philadelphia Eagle team versus secondary of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that's banged up with Antonio Winfield out. But with all those receivers, I don't see them doing much. We saw it was the Dallas Goedert and Saquon Barkley show, and this could be a game where the Eagles get off to a nice lead early and start running the football. So those wide receivers, like I said, we haven't seen anything from them. They will sit. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, they're locked in. It starts every week. I know Mike Evans, the last 2 weeks, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points, but he's a big play wide receiver, and we know this Eagle team is vulnerable to giving up big plays. I think Evans bounced back this week. He's a star. Chris Godwin off to a great start, 3 weeks in a row with a touchdown in each game, and he's one of the best possession wide receivers. And now that he's back in the slot even more this year, he's been putting up huge numbers. New England Patriots at the San Francisco 49ers, Jalen Polk, Demario Douglas. These are players you can't trust in this offense. This offense, passing the football, is just inconsistent. And we've seen it the last couple of years in New England where wide receivers really haven't had any impact and they're week in, week out inconsistent players. So both Jalen Polk and Douglas, even though Douglas came off 14.8 fantasy points last week, so sit. Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Jennings starts. Looks like Debo is going to be out once again in this ball game where they said it was a multiple week injury. Ayuk, last week, I know the numbers weren't great, but the thing was he did get 10 targets. We don't know if George Kittle's going to return as well without add to the targets. So he's a start. And Jawan Jennings, after coming off 11 catch, 175 yard, 3 touchdown game, obviously I know it's not going to happen again at those levels, but he's definitely a wide receiver that has good rapport and a good track record with Brock Purdy when he's gotten the opportunity, and also a couple years ago working with Purdy in the second team. But before Purdy was the starter, so the rapport's there, the chemistry's there, and anytime someone comes off an explosive ball game, that he's got to be added in pretty much all 10, 12 team leagues, and someone in your starting lineup. Washington Commanders at the Arizona Cardinals. Terry McLaurin had his biggest game of the year, 4 catches, 100 yards, and he found the end zone. But I still not going to 100% put him in the starting lineup. I think he's a solid flex, is Terry McLaurin. We know the wide receiver position is definitely deep this season, where guys like McLaurin and 2 receiver and flex leagues, they're not even in some starting lineups at weeks. But McLaurin, like I said, finally had the breakout game. Big 55-yard catch early in that ball game, and then a clinching 20-yard touchdown on the sidelines, keeping that knee in bounce, making a nice diving grab. So Terry McLaurin, he's a playmaker, no doubt about it. Him and Jaden Daniels are working on rapport and consistency, and it was good to see McLaurin have a big ball game. So this week I think is a flex option in a potential back and forth scoring ball game. This week at Arizona, Luke McCaffrey had his best game as a pro. Still, I don't believe it's enough for him to really go on a fantasy value or be an option at this time, so he's a sit. Noah Brown a sit for me as well. He almost had a touchdown, stopped at the 1-yard line in that game at the Cincinnati Bengals. But Noah Brown's not getting consistent targets and not on the field a lot, running a lot of routes. He's a sit. Marvin Harrison, after a bad week 1 the last 2 weeks, he's found the end zone. Week 2, 2 touchdowns, 130 yards in that ball game versus the Rams. And then last week versus the Detroit Lions, he found the end zone once again as Harrison. So he was drafted 2nd, 3rd round, most fantasy drafts, and he's an easy start. Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, pretty much number 2, 3 wide receivers on this roster, but players who haven't done much for this Arizona Cardinal team. So they easy sits this week. They should be owned in 14-team leagues or deeper, but not fantasy options, consistently in the starting lineup. Kansas City Chiefs at the Los Angeles Chargers. Rashee Rice, he's a top 10 wide receiver weekly in fantasy football. And coming into the year, if I thought he wasn't going to get suspended, he definitely was someone I would have been higher on. And now he's come out, he's putting up big games. He's the number 1 target in the passing game, with even Travis Kelce taking a back seat this season. So Rashee Rice, he's locked in weekly. Xavier Worthy is sit for me as well. The targets really haven't been there. Consistency really hasn't been there. And this offense is pretty much ground and pound the football and working through Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce as the number 2 option, with no one else really doing much. I know Juju Smith-Schuster found the end zone last week, but Patrick Mahomes is still going to spread the football out. But Rashee Rice is going to be the player peppered with targets. So Worthy, a sit. Quentin Johnston, Lab McConkey, Joshua Palmer, all sits for me. I know Johnston, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, but this could be a ball game where it's going to be tough sledding the whole way, even if Justin Herbert does play, even though he's not 100% with the ankle injury, even though they didn't find any structural damage, which is a good thing. This offense had a tough time in Pittsburgh, and this week, even if Herbert starts not at 100%, all these wide receivers, I don't think they're consistent enough yet to put up numbers. And also, we don't know if Joshua Palmer's playing. He was out in last week's game, so with the tough matchup and Herbert possibly not starting or starting and not 100%, I'm going to shy away from all 3 wide receivers in this one. Cleveland Browns at the Vegas Raiders. Amari Cooper, he finally stepped up and had the monster ball game versus a weak New York Giants secondary. Week 3 loss where he had 7 catches, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 12 targets. So finally, him and Deshaun Watson got on the same page for this Cleveland Brown team. We know this secondary isn't good at all with the Vegas Raiders. We saw Deontay Johnson just go out there for 120 yards and find the end zone. So Cooper back in the good gracious and his start. Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore. Jeudy had a couple decent games, but he's not someone who's consistent enough, even in a great matchup versus this week Vegas Raiders secondary. He's a sit for me, Jeudy. Definitely someone that should be rostered in 12-team leagues or deeper, but this offense don't produce enough points or enough yards for Jeudy and Cooper to both be starts. So he's a sit. Elijah Moore, a sit for me as well. He had a nice ball game with double-digit fantasy points. Was Elijah Moore in week 2 with Jacksonville, but consistency hasn't been there. He's a sit. Devontae Adams is a starter. I know Denzel Ward most likely is going to be on him, but Adams, even as a floor number 2 wide receiver, I think is pretty decent for fantasy. Jakobi Meyers coming off a monster ball game, no doubt about it, but I have to see him multiple weeks. And in that second half of the ball game, it was just garbage time in that one for Jakobi Meyers and the Raiders, where he put up big points, no doubt about it, with 7 catches, 62 yards, a touchdown and a 2-point conversion. But the 2 previous weeks to start the season, he didn't reach double-digit fantasy points, so he's still a sit for me. In this one is Jakobi Meyers. Monday Night Football, Buffalo Bills at the Baltimore Ravens. Khalil Shakir, he's definitely the number 1 wide receiver, I believe, in this offense for this Buffalo Bill team. Coming off another great performance, 6 catches, 72 yards, and a touchdown in that one. And the Bills, they routed the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 3 in an easy victory on Monday night. So this week, a little bit tougher of matchup. But Shakir in the slot, and also a play who has deep ball threat ability. I like him as a flex option, even in a tougher matchup. And like I said, anytime you're a number 1 target in an offense with Josh Allen, your quarterback, you're going to have flex appeal at minimum weekly. If you're getting a lot of reps, Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Matt Collins, they're just not producing enough. They're not running enough routes, and they're not consistent to be starters each week. It was good to see Coleman have a touchdown, but it was the only catch for 24 yards and a TD for Keon Coleman. So far, he's not out there on a lot of snaps. He's not getting a lot of targets per game, pretty much minimum opportunities, especially the last 2 weeks. And this week for Keon Coleman, he's a sit. Same with Curtis Samuel. Not a lot of looks, not a lot of targets. This offense is pretty much on Josh Allen, just spreading the football out. Dalton Kincaid in the middle of the field. James Cook making plays out of the backfield, catching the football, and obviously running in between the tackles. Now to the Ravens, Zay Flowers a start. He's a start pretty much each and every week. Number 1 target in this passing game for this Baltimore Raven team. Some weeks he'll have great weeks, and some weeks he'll be pedestrian weeks. And he reminds me, as well as the Devonta Smith type, where some games he'll pop off, just not the higher ceiling like Smith, and then some games will be minimum value, but he's like a mini Devonta Smith in terms of scoring the football, ceiling-wise and floor for Zay Flowers. But this week in a high-scoring matchup, potentially he's a start. Rashad Bateman, he had a good game last week at the Dallas Cowboys, but this week versus the Buffalo Bills, he's not someone I'm going to have in the starting lineup. I got to see multiple weeks in a row for Rashad Bateman to go out there and put up numbers this week. Tennessee Titans at the Miami Dolphins, first 2 Monday night games. Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, they're both sits for me. This offense is too inconsistent. Hopkins, I know last week he looked healthy. He went out there and made some plays, found the end zone, and maybe he's getting towards 100%. And in this matchup, I know this Dolphin defense isn't all that great, but Will Levis, he's just been one of the worst quarterbacks in the league this season, turning the football over, missing his plays, and just not getting consistent targets to these wide receivers. And same with Calvin Ridley in week 2, monster ball game versus the Jets, found the end zone twice, and then last week held to 1 catch, so very inconsistent. We know Jalen Ramsey is going to cover one of these wideouts, even though I don't think Jalen Ramsey as good as he was. He's still a pretty decent corner, but not an elite one, and I still think Hopkins or Ridley, whoever he covers, he could limit them in this one. Tyreek Hill, a start for me. I know last week he didn't do anything, 3 catches, 40 yards, but it just takes one big play for Tyreek Hill to have his fantasy day, and it's going to be Tim Boyle most likely. Skylar Thompson banged up, and beat writers are saying they're not expecting him to play for this Dolphin team. So Tyreek Hill, to me, it doesn't matter the quarterback. He's still someone I'm putting in the starting lineup. Jalen Waddle, a flex option. Last season, Waddle struggled at times with injury and even with Tua quarterback. And he was non-existent in the week 3 game and even week 2 towards the end of that ball game as well versus the Buffalo Bills. So Jalen Waddle at best is a back-end 2 receiver flex option where we have to see more out of him. But wait, there's been a backup quarterback in there. The numbers haven't been great at all. Seattle Seahawks, Detroit Lions, last game of the week. And second on Monday Night Football, DK Metcalf, he's a start each and every week. Last 2 weeks, he's gone out there over 100 yards and found the end zone. Week 2 in New England, 129 yards, a touchdown. And last week in that ball game, over 100 yards and found the end zone was Metcalf. So he's looking like the true number 1 easily once again for the Seattle Seahawks team. And he's off to a way better start this year than he was last season. Jackson Smith-Njigba, it's just a lot of mouths to feed over there with the backfield with Charbonnet or Walker, whoever's going to be the running back this week. And Smith-Njigba, he definitely had a monster game in Week 2 versus the Pats. 11 catches, over 100 yards in that one. But in Week 3, he didn't do anything really with Smith-Njigba in that ball game versus the Miami Dolphins. He's a flex option to me. There's going to be some big weeks for Njigba, and there's going to be weeks with Tyler Lockett's the guy over there. So Njigba, like I said, he over 100 yards in Week 2. And then last week, only 3 catches for 39 yards in that ball game. And Tyler Lockett's a sit. So Lockett so far this season, he hasn't been horrible. Week 1, he had over 10 fantasy points. Week 2, didn't do much. And then Week 3, 9.60 fantasy points in PPR leagues with 5 catches, 46 yards on 8 targets. So Tyler Lockett, he's going to have some decent weeks. But this week in a matchup at the Detroit Lions, I don't know if the volume will be there enough. Well, I believe they're going to try to run the football a decent amount. And, DK Metcalf is the only consistent receiver week in and week out for the Seattle team. And now to the Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Week 1 had a bad ball game. In the last 2 weeks now, he's found the end zone. He's putting up numbers. And he was a top 6-7 pick in most fantasy drafts. He's a must-start. Jameson Williams, first 2 weeks. Week 1, monster performance, 120 yards and a touchdown versus the Rams. Week 2, another good performance for him. 5 catches, 79 yards. And then last week, a dud performance. But Jameson Williams now, especially if Sam Laporta might miss this game, the targets are going to go up even more where Laporta's got an ankle injury. So we'll see if he guts it out and plays with the extra day. But either way, Jameson Williams reminds me of a Devonta Smith where he was a boom or bust wide receiver as the number 2 option. And it's the same thing here as well for Jameson Williams, I believe, in this dynamic offense where they got a lot of playmakers. In some weeks, it's just not going to be there for Williams, but we know the upside and what he could do. So he's a start for me this week. So that's wide receiver starts it every matchup. Week 4 of the fantasy football season.